Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we commemorate Yom Hazikaron, the day that we mourn the fallen IDF soldiers in its many wars and the victims of terror as that war continues. To help us commemorate this very solemn day, we're participating in a virtual walking tour of the Herzl Military Cemetery in Jerusalem. Our guide in this walking tour will be Dr. David Bernstein, Dean Emeritus of the Pardes Institute in Jerusalem. David holds a BA and an MA in history and a PhD in religious education from New York University. Just before turning it over to David, as a housekeeping note, um, David will walk us through our Herzl with a number of slides. There'll be one, maybe two places where he's going to stop, and we'll take one or two questions. But the goal basically is to keep walking through, virtual walking through a cemetery, because David has a lot of information to share with us. So hang in there, and at some point during the talk, we'll stop and take a couple of questions. So without further ado, David, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you, Yardain, for doing the technical work here. It's good to see so many people. It's good to see some familiar faces. And let's begin our tour. We can go to the next slide. So this is the entrance to the Har Herzl Military Cemetery. Har Herzl also has a cemetery for Gedolei Ha'umah, the leaders of the nation, including Theodore Herzl, Zev Jabotinsky, and many prime ministers, including Yitzhak Rabin, and other ministers in previous Israeli governments. We're not going to be looking at that today. It's Yom Hazikaron. We're going to be focusing on those soldiers who fell in Israel's wars and victims of terror, civilians who were killed. In particular, we're going to focus on members of the Israeli military who fell. So let's go on to the next slide. As we come in, for some of you who haven't been at Har Herzl for the last couple of years, you can see on the left-hand side that dome-shaped structure is relatively new, only built a couple of years ago. It's called Heichal HaZikaron, Remembrance Hall, and it contains the names of all of those who fell defending Israel. Let's continue. And we begin our tour really here. We begin 75 or 76 years ago, 1947, 1948, with the UN partition resolution of November 29th, 1947, calling for the creation of an independent Jewish and Arab state in Palestine. The Arab states and the leaders of the Palestinian National Movement had declared that they would make sure that that was never implemented. And so when the partition plan is approved by the UN, November 29th, Chavtet November 1947, there begins what I would call the first phase of the War of Independence, Milchemet HaShichrur. And that's a time when the British are still controlling Palestine, but for the most part, they try to stay out of the fighting. And it's basically a fight between Jews and Arabs living in Palestine. Attacks on Jewish settlements begin almost immediately after November 29th. And Jerusalem in particular was under siege from early December 1947 until July 1948. The road to the rest of the country was cut by Palestinians operating from villages surrounding the road, on either side of the road. And when Israel declares its independence on Hey ER 75 years ago today, May 14th, 1948, the Arab armies launched their invasion, including the Jordanian Arab Legion. And it's then that the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem falls. on May 25th, 1948, 11 days after independence was declared. And this is a memorial to those who were killed defending the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the quote a little bit clearer. V'kibatztim miyarketei aretz, it says on the right, I will gather you from the corners of the earth. And on the left-hand side, va'atzmotehem kideshe yifrachu, and their bones, like grass, will blossom, will grow. The story of the defense of the old city includes that of 76 Jews who were killed in its defense. They were actually buried in a courtyard in the old city, in the Jewish quarter of the old city. They couldn't get out. They were under siege. Rav Orenstein was the Rav of the Jewish quarter at the time. And after the 1967 war, when the old city was retaken by Israeli forces, the bodies in the courtyard were uncovered and reburied on Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives. So what we're going to be looking at now is a memorial, not actually a burial place. Let's go inside. Next slide. So here you can see the memorial plaques for at least a few, look at a few of the 76 Jewish defenders who were killed in defense of the Jewish quarter of the old city. Shimon Kobi on the right, the son of Yehudit and Shlomo, born in Jerusalem, fell in the battle for Jerusalem, for the old city, on the 18th of Shvat, and he was 18 years old when he died. And at the end, of course, Tehei Nishmato Tzurah B'Tzorah Chaim, may his soul be bound up with those of the living. And I want to pay special attention to the formula here. This is the formula that's used on all of the, or almost all, of the matzevot in the Har Herzl Cemetery. It's almost uniform. It reflects the collective identity of the Israeli people, and it's only the name and the name of the parents and when they fell and the date that really changes, but the formula remains pretty much the same, as we'll see throughout the cemetery. On the left-hand side, Shulamit Kobi, the sister of Shimon Kobi, daughter of the same parents, Yehudit and Shlomo, also born in Jerusalem, also fell in Jerusalem, defending the old city. On Chet Iyar, the 8th of Iyar, it means her yurtzeit is 3 days from now, 1948. She was 20 years old, 2 years older than her younger brother, who died only a few months before. Let's go to the next slide. Here are two more of those 76. Yaakov Shevach Levanon, the son of, I'm reading on the right side, the son of Yafa and Eliyahu Yoshua, born in Tzfat, fell in the battle for Jerusalem, the old city, on the 18th of Iyar. 13 days from now is his yurtzeit, 19 years old when he died. And on the left, Yitzchak Mizrahi, the son of Rivka and Sion, born in Jerusalem, fell in the battle defending the old city on the 14th of Iyar, 36 years old. So we can see a little bit of diversity here, but we'll see much more as we come to the next slide, because we're now going to walk over next to the memorial for the defenders of the Jewish quarter of the old city. There is this monument, and this is a monument to the submarine Dakar. You can see Dakar written on the left-hand side, and the image looks like a submarine. The story of the Dakar is a tragic story of a submarine that was purchased from England in and set sail in 1968. And at midnight on January 25th, 1968, as it was sailing in the Mediterranean from Portsmouth to Israel, communication was lost. And searches took place. It was not found until 31 years later, 1999, at the bottom of the Mediterranean, on course to Haifa, about 250 miles off the coast of Gaza. And at the time when it was lost in 1968, it was not clear whether it was due to enemy action. The Egyptians and Israelis were engaged in a war of attrition following the Six-Day War in 1968. And it turns out that it was some kind of mechanical failure. Let's go to the next slide. And here you can see when it was found in 1999, a remnant of the submarine that was added at that time to the monument. But if we go to the next slide, we can see that it says Lezecher, in memory of, Achi, meaning a boat in the Israeli fleet, Dakar, and its number was 77. Let's go one more slide. And there's a beautiful verse from Tehillim, from Psalms. Biyam darchecha, in the sea is your way, ushvilcha b'mayim rabim, and your paths are in many waters, v'ikvotecha lo noda'u, and your traces are not known. From Tehillim, chapter 77. And let's go to the next slide, because this monument also goes downstairs, this memorial. And we follow the way downstairs. You can see from the bright Jerusalem sunshine, we're going into the dark. And the architects of this memorial, I think, were very, very purposeful in what they were doing. Let's go to the next slide. And you can see we're going to go through a passageway, and it gets darker. Keep going. We're underground now, just like a submarine is under the water. Okay, we're continuing to walk, and this is what we come to. Underground, there is light coming through from the roof. And let's go to the next slide, and we'll see. Here you can see it says Lezecher, right, in memory of. Again, this is not a burial place. All of these sailors are buried underwater. But one of the things that's remarkable about this memorial, if you pay attention, is how it reflects the kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. And let's take a look. The first one is Yechezkel Sasson, the son of Salima and Nuri, born in Iraq, on the right. On the left, we have Alexander Sharoni, whose original name was Kandel, who was born in Romania. So this is Iraq and Romania. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Now we come to Shlomo Ofek, who used to be Opochinsky, right? Many people Hebraicize their name. Some people still do, but in those days, in the early years of the state, it was much more common. And he was born in Poland. So we have Iraq, Romania, Poland. And on the left, Ran Shimon was born in Bulgaria. Let's go to the next slide. Avraham Baz was born in Tunis, in Tunisia. And Yosef Chaim Suissa was born in Morocco. Let's go to the next slide. Chaim Bar-Zev, born in Germany. Let's think about that just for a moment. He was 21 when he fell in 1968, which means he was born in 1947. He was probably the child of Holocaust survivors in a DP camp in Germany. On the left-hand side, David Ben Shalom, born in Russia. Let's go again to the next one. Menachem Degani, born in Hungary. And Reuven Gal, on the left, born in Argentina. Next slide. Michael Hadar, Morocco. Azriel Dror, born in Italy. Keep going. Then we have on the right side something quite strange. Meir Yaron, born in Cyprus. Was there a Jewish community in Cyprus in 1948? Well, there was. Detention camps created by the British, Jews who were trying to come illegally into the land of Israel, and the British were blockading the coast of Israel, preventing them from coming in. I think many of us know the story of the Exodus, 1947 ship. And many of those who tried to get in and were caught by the British were sent to detention camps in Cyprus, where they once again stood behind barbed wire. We're talking about overwhelmingly survivors of the Shoah. He was born in Cyprus, no doubt in one of those detention camps. On the left, Yeshayahu Yochai, born in Turkey. Next slide. Shevi Yaakov Maor was born in Lita in Lithuania. And Yisrael Karmi was born in Egypt. Next. Reuven Snapir was born in Austria, and Binyamin Maimon, or Wasserman originally, was born in Latvia. Avraham Atari was born in Yemen. Yitzhak Ogen was born in France. So we can go back to the previous slide. So I didn't count how many countries we're talking about, but on this one submarine, we have the kibbutz galuyot, and I didn't even include any of those who were born in Israel. Of course, there are some of those too. But we really have a reflection of the ingathering of the exiles, the massive aliyah to Israel that took place after it was created in 1948, both from DP camps in Europe, as well as from Arab countries in the Middle East and North Africa into the 1950s and even into the early 60s. In the first 2 years of Israel's existence, its population doubled. Again, it was a result of the massive aliyah from so many places. Some people say this is why our food is so good in Israel, because we have the cuisine of 70 nations within our own kitchens. The next slide shows us a different kind of grave, and this is indeed a real grave. And you'll notice that there are memorial plaques, there are matzevot, but they're all together, they're not separate. This is the common grave of those who fought and died defending Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion was a series of settlements established in the 1920s and the 1930s. The land was purchased by a Jew named Holtzman. Holz in German and Yiddish is wood, and hence they named it Gush Etzion, Eitz, tree or wood. They were mostly religious settlements, but there were also at least one secular kibbutz amongst them. They lay between Jerusalem and Hebron. Shortly after November 29th, 1947, the partition resolution, these settlements come under attack. They're very badly outnumbered by the Arab cities and villages around them. Most of the women and children were evacuated, and there was an attempt to try to rescue them, and we'll come to that in a moment. In January 1948, the final battle for the defense of Gush Etzion took place in kibbutz Kfar Etzion, and it fell on the 4th of Iyar, meaning the yahrzeit was yesterday. 153 defenders of Kfar Etzion were massacred, and here is where they lie, and they lie this way in a common grave because tragically their bodies were mutilated, and it was not possible to identify individual victims. David Ben Gurion, who was the leader of the, leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel at the time and would become Israel's prime minister, writes in his biography that the defenders of Gush Etzion saved Jerusalem because they held out for so long and protected the southern flank of Jerusalem. He also writes, it's one of the reasons why today is Yom Hazikaron. Yom Hazikaron, the 4th of Iyar. I'm sorry, before I referred to Yom Ha'atzmaut as being today. I'm in Israel and it's already turning into Yom Ha'atzmaut. But the Dalet Iyar, the 4th of Iyar, is Yom Hazikaron. And one of the reasons Ben Gurion writes that it was chosen was because it was meant to memorialize the defenders of Gush Etzion. Let's go to the next slide. That rescue attempt that I mentioned earlier took place in January 1948, again, before the state was established. 35 young men, many of them university students, took upon themselves to take a very circuitous route and to try to bring supplies and medicine to the beleaguered defenders of Kfar Etzion. They were caught on the way. There's a famous story about how they passed a shepherd on the way. They debated whether or not to kill him. They did not. And according to this story, the shepherd then informed the local villages. And these 35 young men were killed on their way to Gush Etzion. Some of you may be familiar with the street in Jerusalem called Rehov Halamed Hey. That's in memory of these 35 young men who carried inordinate burdens on their back of weapons, medical supplies, trying to relieve the siege of Kfar Etzion. The next slide will take us back to that mass grave of the defenders of Kfar Etzion, and will bring us to two people. On the right, Esther Kaufman, the daughter of Bluma and Moshe, born in Poland, made Aliyah in 1947, Tafshin Zayin, fell in the battle defending Gush Etzion. 1948, women were very numerous among the fighters. It was all hands on. There were also many Haredim among the fighters. She fell on the 4th of Iyar in the defense of Gush, in its last defense of Kfar Etzion. 24 years old when she fell. She was a member of Kfar Etzion, of the kibbutz. And on the left-hand side, Zalman Kaufman, the son of Krindel and Yehuda Yosef, born in Czechoslovakia, made Aliyah 1945 or 1946, fell in the battle defending Gush Etzion on Dalet Iyar, the 4th of Iyar. Today is their yahrzeit. 28 years old when he fell, and he was also of Kfar Etzion. This was a couple that survived the Shoah in Europe, made Aliyah separately, met here in Israel, married. They were each the sole survivors of their extended families. They were killed defending Kfar Etzion, and they had no children. The Kaufman line and his wife's line ended here. This is also a mass grave, and also from the 1948 war. The 1948 war was the most horrific of all of Israel's wars. About 6,000 Jews were killed. That was about 1% of the population at the time. 1% may sound like a small number, but if you take any country's population, the United States, for example, 1%, if there are 300 million plus people in America, 1% would be 3 million people. That's far more than America lost in any of its wars. We come to this area, and let's go back. Yes, this is the common grave of soldiers who fought the Battle of the Castel. We mentioned that Jerusalem was under siege. And so the road to Jerusalem was the site of many battles, some of which the Israeli forces lost and some of them they won. And in this case, the Battle of the Castel, Castel is a tall mountain. If you come to Jerusalem, it's the last big hill before you begin the actual ascent to the city of Jerusalem. So it's a very strategic location. It changed hands numerous times. There were many lives lost. And here again, there's a common grave because the bodies were mutilated. We can go to the next slide. Not far from the common grave of those who fought and died at the Castel, there is the section of those who were killed in the Sinai campaign of the fall of 1956. And we can see here two matzevot. On the right hand, Nuri Rachamim, the son of Ne'ima and Salah, born in Iraq, made Aliyah in what was probably 1951 as part of the large Iraqi Aliyah to Israel. Fell in the Sinai campaign on the 27th of Cheshvan, which was November 1st, 1956. He was 22 when he died, and he was a simple soldier. He didn't have any special rank. But right next to him is Asaf Simchoni. Asaf Simchoni, the son of Yehudit and Mordechai, was born in Nahalal. Nahalal is the birthplace of Moshe Dayan, the birthplace of Yonatan Geffen. It's kind of like one of the great centers that produced many great secular leaders in the Zionist movement and in Israeli history. And he died on October 6th in the Sinai campaign, which was the 20th of Kislev. I'm sorry, he was born in 1922. He died on November 6th, 1956, at the age of 34. But I want you to notice under the Tzahal insignia, under the insignia on the top right of the Israeli Defense Forces, you can see that it doesn't only have his serial number, like Nuri Rachamim. His number was, Asaf Simchoni's was 11344, Nuri Rachamim was 275531. That's their military serial number, but it has a Hebrew word next to the serial number. Asaf Simchoni was an aluf. He was a general. And the general is buried next to the simple soldier with the same formula, nothing grander, nothing more elaborate. And this, I think, is a beautiful expression of the egalitarian nature of Israel, certainly in those years, where a general is buried next to what was probably a private. And if you don't look closely, you can't tell the difference. Let's go to the next slide. So we come to this particular matzeva, but I want to stop here. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll try to answer as best we can.
You can use the raise hand feature on the bottom of your screen. Yes, Susan.
Yeah, I'm just starting by breaking the rule and just not having a question, but wanting to say, David, thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, Susan.
Yes.
I see that. Yeah. Someone else has raised their hand?
Yeah. Hey, David. It's Aaron Resnick. Thank you.
Hi, Aaron.
I noticed in the photos of the grave sites of the 35 killed from Gush, it almost looked like a little birdhouse or some sort of little box next to them. Do you know what those are, what those represent?
Yes, it's like a little structure to put a yurtzeit candle in. to protect it from the wind.
Very practical. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. By the way, for those of you who've been to Har Herzl, the military cemetery, on Yom Hazikaron, if you've come in the morning, there are literally thousands and thousands of people. It's crowded in the cemetery. And that's true in all of the military cemeteries in Israel on the morning of Yom Hazikaron. And I'm sorry that we can't feel that through this walking tour. We're doing a walking tour, let's say, at 7 o'clock in Israel when it's pretty much deserted. People are already preparing for Yom Ha'atzmaut here. Deborah has a question.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering about people changing their names.
Yes.
I think it's probably because they had European names that they wanted to be more Israeli. I'm just kind of amazed that that was tracked and kept track of in that way. So I don't know if you have anything else to add on that subject.
No, it was very, very common in the early days of the state. It was actually a requirement of diplomats, Israeli diplomats. And many people did keep their names, but many people changed them. And I think that, and I know people who made Aliyah more recently in the 1970s and 80s who Hebraicized their name. I actually toyed with the idea myself. The Bernstein, I learned from the menu at Shmulka Bernstein's, as some of you may remember. I learned that it means amber. And in Hebrew, the word for amber is inbar. And I know Bernsteins who changed their name to Inbar, not relatives, but other people with that name. Inbar is a much more common Israeli name, and it sounds more Israeli, and it's easier to pronounce for Israelis. And I remember asking my father, how would he feel? I'm the only son in the family. If I changed my name to Inbar, he was not very happy with it. I think for many people, the changing of the name was meant to also signify a rebirth. That their coming to Israel was a transformative moment in their life. They were not the same people as they once were. Today, it's, as I said, much less common than it was then.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to our slides. So I have a sigh every time I see this photo. If I was taking you on an actual visit in person to Har Herzl on Yom Hazikaron, we would see from a distance, I never come this close, we would see from a distance a family standing by this grave. And one of the people who was standing there is a very recognizable figure in Israel with a pretty long white beard. And his name is Auman, Shlomo Auman. Shlomo Auman, I'm sorry, is the son. Yisrael Auman, with a long white beard. Yisrael Auman, some of you may have heard of, some of you may know him even. He made Aliyah. He was born in Brooklyn. I think he went to the Yeshiva Flatbush. And he became he entered academia, and he ultimately won the Nobel Prize for, I think it's game theory and economics. He was one of the first Israelis to win the Nobel Prize. And he lives in Jerusalem. And this is the grave of his son, Shlomo Auman, the son of Esther and Yisrael. Born in Jerusalem and fell in Lebanon in the First Lebanon War, which in Israel we call Milchemet Shlomo Galil or Mivtza Shlomo Galil, in 1982, in the summer of 1982. And there's a story about Professor Auman and the loss of his son. Professor Aumann is a religious man. Lives in Rechavia, at least he used to live in Rechavia. I'm not sure he still does, in Jerusalem. And he used to be a regular attendee of a Talmud shiur given by Rav Gustman. Rav Gustman was a survivor of the Shoah, made Aliyah to Israel, and founded a yeshiva called Netzach Yisrael. Not surprisingly, a survivor of the Shoah would call his yeshiva Netzach Yisrael, the eternity of Israel. And Rav Gustman would go to a weekly Talmud shiur given by Professor Aumann would go to a weekly Talmud shiur given by Rav Gustman in his yeshiva. I was privileged to hear Rav Gustman teach, really a brilliant and soft-spoken, wonderful man. And the story is told that when the news came of the death of Shlomo Alman in the First Lebanon War in 1982, Rav Gustman attended the funeral. And after the funeral, he actually went straight to the home of Professor Aumann. And he said to Professor Aumann, all of the soldiers who've given their lives for the Jewish state, they're all holy. He said, I want you to know, I once had a son. His name was Meir, and he was killed by the Germans in the Shoah. And he was a martyr. He was a kadosh. He was holy. But your son, Shlomo, he gave his life in defense of other Jews. He was a tzaddik. He was a righteous man. And I envision right now that in heaven, Shlomo is joining Meir. And they're praying together, and Meir is part of the minyan. But Shlomo is the shliach tzibur. He has the honor of being the prayer leader. And supposedly Professor Aumann said, Rebbe, I never thought I could be comforted, but you brought me some comfort. Let's go to the next slide. This is the grave of Chana Senesh. Chana Senesh, who was a young woman who made Aliyah around the time that I think she was about 18 years old, from Hungary, came from a secular family, saw the growing anti-Semitism in Hungary and made Aliyah. She belonged to Kibbutz Sdot Yam, which is near Caesarea. Then it was called, the kibbutz was called Caesarea. Now we call it Sdot Yam. She was there was an attempt by the British, as well as the Haganah, the Jewish Defense Force in the land of Israel at the time during World War II, to parachute Jews into behind enemy lines in order to work with the partisans and in order to help the Jewish communities there. And she was parachuted into Yugoslavia, where there were many partisans, and her mission was to enter Hungary. She was caught at the border by Hungarian guards. She was arrested. She was tortured severely. And here it tells us that she parachuted as in the shlichut of the nation, in the service of the nation, to the land of the enemy. She was tried in Budapest and executed by firing squad at the age of 23. Next to her, if you look on the left side, are other paratroopers who were also fought and killed, trying to help partisan groups and trying to help the Jewish communities in Nazi-occupied Europe. Let's go to the next slide. This is a more recent memorial which was only built in the 1990s. And it's a memorial to the 200,000 Jewish soldiers in the Red Army, the Russian Army, Soviet Army, who died in World War II fighting the Germans. 200,000 is quite a number. It was built in the 1990s, I think, with the express purpose of bringing the massive Russian Aliyah into the narrative of the Jewish state. Technically, one could argue, what's it doing here? They didn't fight for the Jewish state, but I think the government felt that this was a way of saying they fought for the Jewish people as well as for the Allied cause. And it was a way to bring them into the more larger narrative. Right next to it, which I don't have a slide of, is a memorial to Jews in the Polish army who fought the Nazis as well. Let's go to the next slide. So we come to the grave of Alex Singer. Alex Singer was a young man who was the son of two people whom I knew very well, who've recently passed away in the last few years, Suzanne and Max Singer. Born in America, he went to Cornell University, made Aliyah in 1985 on his own, fell in a battle in Lebanon, fighting terrorists on the 21st of Elul, 1987, which was actually his 25th birthday. And I want to share with you something that this brilliant young man, who was a very talented artist and a very talented writer, and really an inspiration to many people, many young people, something he wrote when he was in officer training course, because he was a lieutenant in the Israeli army. And he writes the following poem during officer training school. Once in a while, as I progress toward the course's end, I feel a pang of fear. Today, I felt such fear. If the war comes, I will have to lead men to die. But those men were not men a short time ago. Some don't even shave yet. And I will have to have the calm power to yell to them or to whisper, Kadima, meaning move forward. And I will have to have the calm power to step forward myself. Let's go to the next slide. Yoni Netanyahu. I think there are some people in this audience who still remember the rescue at Entebbe in July of 1976, when Israelis were held hostage in Uganda after their plane was hijacked. And after a waiting period of many days, Israel finally sent a force of Sayeret Matkal, which is perhaps the elite commando unit in the Israeli army, led by Yoni Netanyahu, to rescue about 100 Israelis. If I remember correctly, there were, I think, 102 or 105, something like that. 2 of them were killed, but about 100 came back to Israel safely. It was a very daring mission. They flew about 1,000 kilometers to get there. There've been movies made about it. There are songs about it. The only Israeli soldier to be killed in the operation was Yoni Netanyahu, who led the group, who led the force. And since then, in Israeli military history, it's known as Mivtza Yoni, the Operation of Yoni. Yoni Netanyahu was a very, very special individual. His letters were put together in a book, a real patriot, and a very sensitive young man. That book of letters is actually a very common gift that people give to young men who are about to enter the army. Let's go to the next slide. We're moving closer to our own contemporary period. And this is a grave of someone whom you may have heard of, an American named Michael Levin. Both of these pictures are of his grave. On the left, it tells us that Michael Levin, the son of Hindalea and Meir HaKohen, born in America, he lived in Philadelphia in 1984, made Aliyah in 2003, died in southern Lebanon in the Second Lebanon War in Menachem Av, in the month of Av. He was 22 years old. Michael Levin didn't have to come back to Israel. He was actually in the States visiting his parents. He volunteered to come back and join his unit. And tragically, he was murdered. And on the right-hand side, you can see his grave, which is decorated by many, many groups and individuals, particularly from the United States. This is a stop of many birthright groups. And you could see at the foot of the grave, it says, an American Oleh whose love of God and Israel is eternal. That's new. That's a chidush. All of the graves we've seen up till now, from all of the earlier decades of Israel's history, do not have that inscription, any inscription on the foot of their grave. They all have the same formula. They all look the same. Only the names and the details are different, but there is a uniformity and collectivity that has changed over the years. And so, yes, the matzeva is the same, the shape of the grave is the same, but there's something written at the bottom. And that's a chidush, that's something new. And it goes beyond this. Let's go to the next slide. Here we see other more recent graves. On the right-hand side, we see the grave of Elad, I think it's Elad Deri. And you can see the quote from Tehillim, from the book of Psalms at the bottom, Tzadika Tamar Yifrach Ke'eretz Balvanon Yiskeh, taken from the psalm that we say on Shabbat. And you can see, you might be able to make out at the top, above the matzeva, there's this picture. There are no pictures of those who were killed in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s. But beginning in the 2000s, Israel is becoming less of a collective. There's still a strong collective feeling in Israel, much more so than I remember in the States. But there's more room for individuality. This parallels the decline of socialism and the growth of capitalism and entrepreneurship in Israel. And on the left, you can see an Ethiopian Jew, Ino Asher Pazangaya, who was killed in 2003. And you see there his picture. There's the same matzeva with the same formula, but now there's a picture and something in addition to the matzeva. Let's go to the next slide and we'll see even more. This is Sarit Yechezkel. And here we see, again, more recent graves. Sarit Yechezkel, it's a very, very beautiful inscription here on the footstone. Nechtatenu, our granddaughter, our daughter, our sister, beloved, forever. Your smile is engraved on our hearts. Sarit, the daughter of Mashiach and Siona. who grew up in Tel Aviv. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that, again, the recent graves, the families now are allowed, and many of them do, put a verse or some kind of personal message on the grave of their loved one. Let's continue to the next slide. Now here we can see, again, another, on the right, David Papillon, and on the footstone, I believe it's in Armenian, the inscription. Let's go to the next slide. And here you can see a grave that you can barely make out. It's the grave of Yaakov Kochkin. You see his picture. You see that the bushes are planted with flowers. These are not temporary things. These are more permanent things. And you see the flag of the Sanchanim, of the paratroopers there. You won't find these on the older grave sites. For better or for worse, however you like to understand it. And this is the saddest of all of the slides, because this marks a section which is a newer section, which has yet to be filled. And tragically, it probably will be. Let's go to the next slide. I want to finish by reading a poem with you written by Natan Alterman. He wrote this around the time of the War of Independence in 1948. And it is a poem that is often used at Yom Hazikaron ceremonies in Israel. I'd like to read it in English. The Silver Platter. The silver platter comes from, the term silver platter comes from a quote from Chaim Weizmann, who around this time said that a state is not given to a nation on a silver platter. And Natan Alterman takes that metaphor of a silver platter and writes this poem. And the land grows still, the red eye of the sky slowly dimming over smoking frontiers. As the nation arises, torn at heart but breathing, to receive its miracle, the only miracle. As the ceremony draws near, it will rise, standing erect in the moonlight in terror and joy. When across from it will step out a youth and a lass, and slowly march toward the nation. Dressed in battle gear, dirty, shoes heavy with grime, they ascend the path quietly. To change garb, to wipe their brow, they have not yet found time. Still bone weary from days and from nights in the field, full of endless fatigue and unrested, yet the dew of their youth is still seen on their head. Thus they stand at attention, giving no sign of life or death. Then a nation in tears and amazement will ask, "Who are you?" And they will answer quietly, "We are the silver platter on which the Jewish state was given." Thus they will say and fall back in shadows, and the rest will be told in the Chronicles of Israel. Thank you very much. And I wish us all a Chag Atzmaut Sameach. We should celebrate the gift of the silver platter. Celebrate what we have, and hopefully celebrate together despite our differences.
Amen.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Go to.
I just want to add something. The shape of the matzevot, the tombstone, are kilos.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to close without taking questions since we ended on such a powerful note. We will be sharing David's email address in a follow-up email if you would like to reach out with your questions or comments. Thank you all for joining us. And David.